High ground is one of the most important positional tools that most players don't utilize at all. There are 3 main advantages to holding high ground not only in Overwatch, but in all video games in general. The first of these 3 is to maintain control over your engagements. The simple concept here is gravity. You can always go down to engage a fight, but you can't always come up without taking a specific route or expending a specific cooldown. Let's explore the route example first. Say you're holding high ground on Iconwald, and your opponents don't have high mobility heroes. In order to challenge you, they must take one of 2 flank routes up these tight staircases. Since you're already on high, you're able to peek over and see where the enemies are flanking from, and hold that point tightly. This gives you control over the ways up to you, allowing you to stop opponents from easily taking the fight. If they don't want to use these routes, opponents must alternatively use cooldowns to engage you. A good example of this would be Winston, who can jump up to the high ground, but will then not have his jump cooldown available to disengage should your team light him up. So that's how high ground can allow you to control an engagement. But when is the right time to drop down from the high ground to engage with the enemy? The main thing to consider when choosing when to drop from the high ground is how likely you are to win the fight if you drop down. For this, you may consider things like whether your team gained an elimination, whether the enemy team is generally low on health, or when your team decide to use an ultimate. All of these things grant you an advantage within a fight, so are good times to drop down onto the enemy. I made a video recently outlining all of the advantages you can gain within Overwatch and how to leverage these properly. You can check that out in the end card of this video. Outside of those advantages, there's only really one real reason you may need to drop down from the high ground. Whilst most objectives in Overwatch do not take high ground routes, this does not mean that you don't want to defend objectives from the high ground. But it does mean that you will sometimes need to drop off the high ground if your opponents make it to the objective. The goal of high ground is to ensure that your opponents cannot cross the low ground far enough to even reach the objective. But if they do, then this may be your time to drop down. Learning when to fight from high ground and when to contest the objective is a game sense skill in itself, and now you have a slightly better understanding of how the high ground position can give your team better control. But outside of this control, how else does high ground give you an advantage? Well, the second advantage of holding high ground is the better angle it grants you to fight from. I'll try to explain this in a very concise manner, but essentially looking down on an enemy gives you a larger hitbox to aim at than the enemy has of you, due to the surface you are standing on. This high angle also naturally gives you an easier time hitting headshots, as it's the primary part of the player you're able to see when standing above them. This also gives long-range heroes such as Widowmaker better sightlines to shoot from. As a very simple example, if you're stood below the Iconwald castle, this massive building is a blockage to your sightline. However, if you're stood on top of the castle, this is no longer in view to block your shots. You can also rotate to either side to reopen the sightlines if your opponent is attacking from the opposite direction. Even if you're not playing a long-range hero who utilizes these sightlines, this high ground position still gives you an advantage within the fight. Building on from the last point a little bit, being up on high ground gives you more choice of when you drop to engage an enemy, giving you control over the fight and a natural advantage. Another way that high ground gives you a better angle to fight from comes from abilities. Think of projectile abilities such as Ramatra's Ravenous Vortex, Ash's Dynamite, or Anna's Biotic Grenade. It is much easier to use these abilities downwards than it is to throw them up onto the high ground and have any effect. Even if you're able to land these abilities from low ground, your opponents on the high ground can very simply back up to disengage from the fight should they be under a negative effect from these abilities. A more general advantage that you gain from the high ground is its generally higher viewing angle. From up high, you're more aware of what the enemy team is doing and can gather information from this vantage point. Knowing where they're pathing can help you to figure out and predict what their general plan of pushing may be. And alongside this, you're also able to tell when the enemy team has switched to hero quicker than they can tell that your team has switched to hero from this vantage point. The final advantage that playing high ground gives you is natural cover. In Overwatch in general, playing around natural cover is so important to keeping you alive. Without the presence of an off-tank to peel, and generally less shields being in the game, natural cover is kind of all you have in terms of free protection from enemies in Overwatch 2. If you're fighting an enemy team below you and happen to be losing this fight, you can very easily just hold the S key to back up behind the cover of the surface that you're standing on. From a three-dimensional perspective, this surface acts like any other wall to your opponent, since they're viewing it from a lower angle. This free cover gives you infinite opportunity to recharge your resources, such as receiving healing from a support or just waiting for your important cooldowns to recover. This is especially useful for support players who are able to regenerate their own health via the support passive, as they can maintain the high ground positions alone and continue to re-engage with fights without depending on somebody else to heal them up. If any hero was holding a choke point on low ground and needed to take a moment to regenerate some health or cooldowns, they would have to find a corner to back up to. Not only does this take more time away from you fighting the enemy, it also causes you to lose the position you initially wanted to fight from. And this is another benefit of easy natural high ground cover. It generally gives you more time to focus on shooting the enemies below you. Whilst the enemies below have to run and find places to cover themselves, you have the very convenient option of walking backwards and using this permanent natural cover. This especially applies when your opponents are using resources. For example, if a Moira ults in a fight when everyone is on low ground, your natural instinct should be to give up space and find some cover. However, when you're up on high ground, all you need to do is back up a little bit, and now not only are you safe from the Moira ult, you are also able to maintain your preferred positioning up on the high ground. If you would like to check out the resource management video that I mentioned before, then you can do that over on the right now. If you learned anything at all from today's video, then be sure to share it with your Overwatch buddies so you can all fight from high ground together. Apart from that, I'll see you in Iconworld.